There is a war raging between Nvidia and AMD as to who can get their graphics cards down to the normal price the fastest, and right now it looks like Nvidia are winning. At least that's what the latest GPU pricing data suggests, assessing across a wide range of regions. We're no longer in a situation where graphics cards simply cannot be purchased at all, but 6 months on from many releases, pricing is still a concern for some models, which we'll be exploring throughout today's video. This is a follow-up to the graphics card cost per frame video we produced back in June, where we looked at pricing in 10 regions. We'll still be doing that today, but with updated information for September. These are the 10 countries that watch Hardware Unboxed videos the most, with popular retailers chosen in each country. From there, we've calculated real-world cost per frame data in each of these regions, which allows us to see how competitive Nvidia and AMD are, not just in the United States, but on a more global scale. And we can see which countries tend to get screwed over more than others. But before we get into the data,
today's video is brought to you by WOLFBOX and their portable jump starter range. The 3000A features a 65-watt USB-C fast charger and built-in air compressor, along with enough power to revive completely dead 12-volt car batteries. This all-in-one unit sports a powerful 160 PSI compressor motor, a 400 lumen flashlight with emergency strobing ability, and is entirely supported by the 16,000 mAh battery. The other model we have on hand is the 4000A, which doesn't feature the compressor, but boasts a larger 24,000 mAh battery, capable of starting larger capacity batteries. Both models keep you informed on remaining battery life and other statistics with their LCD displays, and can be left in moderate conditions on standby for 2 years, which is pretty impressive. So to learn more about WOLFBOX and their jump starter offerings, please check the link in the video description.
Here's a quick refresher again on where pricing and value should be based on the globally announced and advertised MSRP in US dollars. The Intel Arc B580 should be the best value graphics card in this metric, though there's a tight battle between it and AMD's Radeon RX 9060 XT series. The 9060 XT 8GB should be 12% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5060 at the same price, with neither worth buying compared to the 9060 XT 16GB, which is 17% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB. For mid-range shoppers, the best value choice is the Radeon RX 9070 XT at $600 US, which is similar value to the RX 9070. These models are slightly better value than the RTX 5070, but also pack more VRAM at 16 versus 12GB. The 9070 XT also competes with the RTX 5070 Ti, but at MSRP there is a $150 price difference, making the Radeon card 16% cheaper per frame. All of these models present superior value to last generation cards, such as the 7700 XT and RTX 4070. Then at the top of the market, the value proposition falls away for cards like the RTX 5080, where you end up paying a premium to access higher performance. The RTX 5090 is clearly the worst value product on the market, though it offers top-tier gaming and is in a class of its own. The RTX 5050 is also a weird one, offering poor value for an entry-level GPU. Now let's flick over to look at real-world pricing for in-stock models at Newegg. In much better news compared to 3 months ago, many more models are actually available at the MSRP, including the RTX 5070 Ti at $750, the RTX 5080 at $1,000, and the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB at $430. In fact, the only current-gen GeForce GPU that is above MSRP is the RTX 5090. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Radeon cards, though the level to which AMD GPUs are inflated depends on the model. The 9060 XT 8GB is readily available at $300 US, which makes it competitive with the RTX 5060, but it's still not a great buy in our opinion. The 16GB model of this GPU is $20 above MSRP, and while that is price inflation we'd rather not see, that price is still good. It's worth spending 8% more per frame than the 8GB model to get double the VRAM, and it's still slightly better value than the 5060. Compared to the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, the cost per frame discount going Radeon shrinks from 17% at MSRP to 13% real world, which is okay, I guess. The Intel Arc B580 is finally in stock at $250 US, now presenting okay value around that price. This makes it 11% cheaper per frame than the 9060 XT 16GB, which isn't amazing, but it's kind of in a different price class and might make sense if you only have around $250 to spend, especially as it still has 12GB of VRAM. It handily beats the more expensive RTX 5060 in value and absolutely smokes the 5050 at the same price, but it would have been nice to see Intel achieve this price point months ago. As for the mid-range, this is where AMD is getting comfortably beaten in the US market right now because they've been unable to get the RX 9070 and 9070 XT to MSRP. Right now, the 9070 XT is $700, which is not competitive with the 5070 Ti. It essentially makes the two cards roughly the same value, in which case you may as well purchase the GeForce GPU. The 9070 is a little better value as it's only $50 above MSRP, but this flips the value equation compared to the RTX 5070. The Radeon model should be 5% cheaper per frame, helping present itself as a strong value choice given it also has more VRAM, but right now it's actually 4% more expensive than the 5070 per frame. This means that for around $500 to $600, the 9070 XT is priced out of contention, and the RTX 5070 re-emerges as acceptable value is maybe the best way to put it, not amazing, but more competitive than it should be based on the MSRPs. Shopping at Micro Center in the US instead of at Newegg doesn't change graphics card value comparisons all that much. In the crucial 5070 Ti versus 9070 XT battle, both models are still $750 and $700 US respectively. The 9060 XT 16GB is also still $370, so it's still 13% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti 16GB. However, what does shift around a bit are prices for the 8GB models, many of which are now below MSRP by $20 or $30. The 9060 XT, for example, is $280, the 5060 is now $270, and we also see the 5060 Ti 8GB fall to $340. Maybe this is indicative of the very low demand for 8GB graphics cards in 2025. As these models have fallen by similar amounts, they maintain similar value propositions to at MSRP. The 9060 XT 8GB is the best value of the 8GB cards, but that doesn't mean it's a good buy overall. We also see the RX 9070 available for $540 at Micro Center, slightly below MSRP, which brings it back into a position of being competitive with the RTX 5070, and I'd say it's clearly superior value to the 9070 XT at that price as well. In Australia, pricing is more normal, and value propositions are more in line with MSRP level pricing. Of course, this isn't always the case, and some GPUs are still overpriced compared to the US MSRP. The 5070 Ti should be more like $1,250 instead of $1,400, factoring in currency conversion and tax. But on the whole, the GPU market is okay for us locally. The 9060 XT 16GB is in a great position, offering 19% lower cost per frame than the 5060 Ti 16GB, so this typically makes it the obvious choice for mainstream gamers. The RTX 5050 is actually surprisingly cheap at PC Case Gear right now, priced below MSRP at $350, but that still doesn't make it a good deal given its limited VRAM and poor overall performance. It just brings its value in line with other budget cards. The 9070 XT is also good value up against the 5070 Ti with a 16% lower cost per frame, the same as at MSRP. Now, what's happened locally is that both models are $100 to $150 above the direct US conversion, but that keeps the MSRP value intact, so most of the time we'd recommend the Radeon card here. However, the RTX 5070 is also a decent choice if you don't want to spend more than $1,000 AUD, and right now it's better value than the RX 9070. At Mindfactory in Germany, we're looking at a relatively normal GPU market with many models at or close to the US MSRP. This actually makes some cards better priced than they should be in the local market, especially on the GeForce side, as Nvidia announced some ridiculously high European MSRPs. One example of this is the RTX 5070 Ti, which has an official MSRP of €880, yet is currently selling for €780, much closer to what the price should be if the $750 US MSRP was accurate worldwide. This keeps some of the value battles in check with MSRP levels. The 9060 XT 16GB is 15% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti 16GB at Mindfactory, about what we'd expect, which makes the Radeon model better value. The 9070 XT is also in a reasonable position, offering 16% better value than the 5070 Ti, sneaking under our threshold for the Radeon card to get a recommendation. The only real deviation I'm seeing compared to MSRP level value is the battle between the 9070 and 5070. At Mindfactory, the 9070 is a little overpriced and the 5070 is a little underpriced, flipping the value equation in favor of Team Green. The 9070 should be 5% cheaper per frame, but is 4% more expensive in reality, so right now Nvidia is doing a better job of tempting buyers with €500 to spend. In the UK, at retailer Scan, it's basically identical to at Mindfactory in Germany outside of a bit of wiggling around for some models. Here the 9060 XT is 13% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti for the 16GB models, the 9070 XT has a 14% lower cost per frame than the 5070 Ti, and the 9070 is 7% more expensive per frame than the 5070, which is down to the 9070 being overpriced. The gap between the 9070 XT and 5070 is probably a little too large for those cards to be in direct competition on price, and the value equation in favor of Radeon suffers as a result. Outside of that, all the low-cost 8GB models are pretty much where they should be in value, though of course we'd argue they should all be cheaper given the limitations of cards with that amount of VRAM. The 9060 XT 8GB is the best value GPU in the chart, but would strongly recommend the 16GB model instead, even though it costs £75 more. At Canada Computers, I'm using an average of the lowest price you can get online and in-store. They sometimes have some models that are only available in-store. Anyway, this chart is a mixture of what we see in the US and European markets. 9070 XT pricing is more favourable here than in the US, with a nearly $200 Canadian price difference to the 5070 Ti, leading to a 14% lower cost per frame for the Radeon model, pretty similar to at MSRP. We get the same margin comparing the 9060 XT to 5060 Ti, 16GB models of course. Then we see the usual issues with the RX 9070. At $865 Canadian, this is priced too close to the 9070 XT, which is currently sitting at $900. This means that instead of offering a 5% cost per frame discount over the RTX 5070, it ends up being 4% more expensive, and it's clearly worse value than the 9070 XT as well. In Canada, you just wouldn't consider purchasing the 9070 at all, which again brings the 5070 back into a position of being competitive. It's not as competitive as some regions with the 9070 XT priced where it is, but it's still a possible choice. In the entry-level position, the standout value choices are either the 9060 XT 8GB or the ARC B580, though each has its own set of weaknesses. The 9060 XT is the more powerful card, hamstrung by VRAM, while the B580 is weaker and doesn't have the driver support of the Radeon model, but is cheaper and has more VRAM. That's a common toss-up we're seeing in the market across regions now that the B580 is at a more reasonable price. The Indian market at prime ABGB is pretty wild with some of the pricing we're seeing. The RX 9060 XT 16GB is in a fantastic position compared to the very expensive 5060 Ti 16GB, offering 24% cheaper cost per frame, which makes it an instant buy. But then on the flip side of that, the 5070 Ti and 9070 XT offer very similar value, making the GeForce card the clear choice. It's unusual to see a situation where in the mainstream AMD is offering even better value than in the US, but at the higher end they're offering worse value. The RX 9070 isn't particularly well priced either, and while it's better value than the 9070 XT, it's 11% more expensive per frame than the RTX 5070. Both of these cards should be the same price going off the US MSRP, but at this Indian retailer, only the 5070 is at MSRP level pricing. So if you are after a mid-range model, the 5070 looks to be the best choice here. The good news for buyers in the Philippines is that this is one of the few regions I saw where the 9060 XT 16GB wasn't overpriced relative to the 8GB model. In fact, if anything, it's better value here. This makes it the clear choice for mainstream GPU buyers, offering 15% better value than the 5060 Ti 16GB. Previously, this was one of the weaker regions for 9060 XT value. The 9070 XT is also quite well priced at retailer DynaQuest, with current pricing leading to a massive 26% cost per frame discount going with this model over the 5070 Ti. This seems to be due to extraordinarily high pricing for this GeForce model, which also carries through to the more premium cards like the 5080 and 5090. The 9070 XT is also more expensive than a direct conversion from the US MSRP into Philippine pesos, but obviously to a far less degree than with the high-end GeForce cards. What's even more interesting is this price inflation for high-end GeForce is only for the high-end models. The RTX 5070 has a relatively normal price, and this allows it to be quite competitive up against the 9070 XT, and especially the 9070, where it's 5% cheaper per frame. The Radeon model should be offering better value, but yet again, it isn't in this competitive mid-range position. In Brazil, there is a 13% cost per frame advantage to AMD in the battle between both the 9060 XT 16GB versus 5060 Ti 16GB, and the battle between the 9070 XT versus 5070 Ti. Graphics cards are very expensive in Brazil, which is quite unfortunate, but in these two main categories, neither brand is clearly the better buy. At best, we'd slightly lean towards AMD here, and the value difference is just shy of where it should be at MSRP. Outside of that, the RTX 5070 is one of the best value graphics cards in Brazil and is much better value than the RX 9070, which amazingly was actually more expensive than the 9070 XT at KaBuM, so you just wouldn't consider it. The 9070 XT costs 10% more per frame than the 5070 and basically sits in a different price category, so Nvidia have got that mid-range position locked up. In the lower parts of the market though, there's not a lot of great choices, especially as the B580 is the same price as the 5060 and 9060 XT 8GB. It should be 17% cheaper than either of those cards and therefore better value. Polish pricing at Morele is in line with other European markets like Germany. The 9060 XT is 14% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti, comparing 16GB models, and the 9070 XT is also 14% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti. Meanwhile, the 9070 is 5% more expensive per frame than the 5070, when it should be the other way around. This is because the 9070 is too expensive relative to the US MSRP, whereas the 5070 is about right. Intel Arc GPUs continue to be reasonable choices in Poland for those after an entry-level GPU. Most of these lower cost options are at normal prices, so comparisons like the 9060 XT 8GB versus RTX 5060 aren't super interesting, of course compounded by the issue with VRAM that makes them hard to recommend. The RTX 5050 is also terrible value here, like it is in most regions. Last retailer I'm looking at is Megekko in the Netherlands. The 9060 XT 16GB is 14% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti 16GB here, continuing a long string of regions where the pricing difference is about that much between these cards. Unlike in Poland, the 9070 XT isn't as good value relative to the 5070 Ti, offering just an 8% cost per frame discount, which isn't enough to give the Radeon card a recommendation. This seems largely due to 9070 XT price inflation here. This is a region where AMD just hasn't been able to get the 9070 XT down to its $600 US MSRP at all retailers. The 9070 is 7% more expensive per frame than the 5070 at Megekko, so like a lot of the regions we've analysed, the 5070 is still a viable choice for mid-range gamers, while the 9070 is pretty much in no man's land. Intel aren't offering the value they should be either, with the B580 priced at €280, which is too close to the 9060 XT 8GB at €300. When looking at graphics card pricing and cost per frame this month, we're seeing a much more consistent market across a variety of regions compared to 3 months ago. Graphics card pricing has settled for the most part, more models are available at the MSRP than ever before, and there are fewer regional outliers. In the mainstream market, there hasn't been too much change, with healthy competition continuing between the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB and RX 9060 XT 16GB. At MSRP, the Radeon model should be about 17% cheaper per frame, and on average across 10 regions, we saw it come in 15% cheaper. Most regions were very consistent at a couple of percent above 17%, largely due to slight overpricing of the 9060 XT 16GB. At the low end, we have a lot of 8GB cards available, also competing with Intel's Arc Battlemage series. The good news is that the B580 is now more readily available at its $250 US MSRP across a range of regions, including in the US itself, which makes it a much more viable option than in past months where it was above $300. Along with the RX 9060 XT 8GB, it's often a card offering near the best cost per frame, with pros and cons each way. Intel do offer more VRAM in this segment, but performance and driver reliability is lower than that of the 9060 XT 8GB, which of course has VRAM issues. Good to see MSRP offerings here. Not great that these are the options we are left with in the sort of sub $300 market, and typically neither the RTX 5060 nor especially the RTX 5050 offer strong value. In most regions, at every segment below the RTX 5090, Nvidia and their partners have done a better job than AMD at ensuring graphics cards are available at the MSRP. And this includes in places like Europe, where GeForce GPUs are readily found below the local MSRP, with pricing more in line with the official US MSRP these days. Even in the US right now, you can find the 5070 for $550, the 5070 Ti for $750, and even the RTX 5080 for $1,000, a much better situation than a few months ago. AMD have not been able to keep up, and as we sit here today, the RX 9070 XT is still $700 US. On a more global scale, this battle between the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti is a bit inconsistent, with price inflation varying depending where we look. In about half the regions we assessed, the 9070 XT offers about 15% lower cost per frame than the 5070 Ti, which is in line with advertised pricing and makes the Radeon card worth considering. In the other half, the margin shrunk between the models, making the GeForce GPU the better buy, and this was usually due to the 9070 XT being too expensive. Given that AMD has been supplying these cards since the start of the year, it's crazy that they're unable to widely offer them at MSRP in September. The most decisive victory in favor of Nvidia is seen in the mid-range, where they've positioned the RTX 5070 almost universally available at MSRP. If all GPUs were available at the MSRP, we'd recommend spending just 10% more to get the RX 9070 XT, but that's rarely a sensible move in the current market. Instead, the 5070 more directly competes with the RX 9070, and again, AMD have been unable to get this model down to its MSRP in a lot of regions. This, combined with the RTX 5070 sometimes selling below MSRP, has flipped the value equation universally in favor of GeForce. The 9070 should be 5% cheaper per frame, but on average we found it was 9% more expensive, and that makes it much harder to recommend. It has taken a long time, but it is good to see Nvidia largely resolve their supply issues as we head into the holiday season, accompanied by several major game releases. There's not a whole lot Nvidia need to do here outside of maybe dropping their crap 8GB models well below MSRP and then focusing on the upcoming super refresh. AMD, on the other hand, should have a clear target in mind: get Radeon GPUs to the MSRP. They won't be able to compete if the 9070 XT is just $50 cheaper than the 5070 Ti in the US, even if they would have loved to make that the official price when the card launched. Just get the cards to the advertised price in all regions, keep chipping away with FSR4 game support, and build on that momentum. So anyway, that's it for this video. If you do appreciate our independent analysis here at Hardware Unboxed, consider signing up and supporting us via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits. We've got our monthly live streams, we've got our Discord chat, great place to chat about tech, BTS content, plenty of other good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.